Hi, I'm here with Damien O'Mahony. Damien is a former senior executive of Cork City Council. Damien lectured in planning for a number of years and set up a planning consultancy company, Keystone, over 10 years ago. So I'm delighted to be here with Damien today. Damien, would you just give me an overview of the evolution of planning in Ireland, first of all?
Well, planning in Ireland is a relatively modern concept, but 63 years old. Prior to 1963, when the first Planning Act came in, there was planning, known as the Town Planning Acts, but these were adoptive, meaning that a local authority could choose to implement them or not. But the 1963 Act was mandatory and became effective throughout the country. And its impetus really was the pretty revolutionary economic plan that was adopted by Sean Lemass back in the late 1950s, which moved Ireland from a protectionist stance to one focused on exportation and foreign direct investment. With that, and very prescient on the part of Lemass, they saw great potential growth, particularly in urban areas, and decided that a legislative framework for the management of planning was critically important. So that was the origin of the original 1963 Planning and Development Act. And there's been multiple amendments to that up to as recently as last year with Planning and Development Amendment Act 2024. So quite a raft of legislation now governs what we do in the area of planning.
That's amazing kind of background, Damien, on the evolution. Just, I suppose, on the current framework, could you just give us an overview on the current framework of the current planning system? And then we might go into some of maybe suggestions or improvements, but just give me an overview of the current framework. Obviously, you have extensive knowledge in your history of lecturing, working as an executive in Cork City Council. So I'd love just to hear your thoughts and opinions.
Okay, so first of all, I think a lot of people approach planning almost on an adversarial basis, imagining that it's them versus the planning authority. I should point out, really, from a local authority point of view, planning is critical. And what they really like to see is development. Development brings housing, puts roofs over people's heads. It brings investment, creates jobs. So fundamentally, local authorities are pro-development. A lot of people forget this important point.
Of course, because obviously we need development to drive investment. We need investment in local authority and infrastructure, and the planning contributions contribute to this purse, which the government can improve local infrastructure and amenities and services.
Absolutely. So the fundamental default position of every planning authority in the country is pro-development. People often forget about that. But on the other hand, unregulated development can cause chaos. So the planning legislation is designed to create a framework within which development can occur, but at the same time that development is appropriate to the needs of what the particular administrative area is. That could be an urban area, that could be a rural area, but without that form of regulation, either in the form of planning or fire regulation or building control, we would be looking at an unfettered development process, which would not be in anybody's interest. And I think sometimes when people see the planning authority exercising its regulatory role, they see it as an adversarial approach to development. It's not. It's an approach of controlling development while at the same time promoting development.
The one thing, Damien, like we hear in the media, is obviously there's an undersupply of houses. We're looking for 60,000 houses this year. It's not going to be achieved. There's a lot of kind of negative press around the planning process, the system what exists, that there's current delays, there's people objecting who aren't from areas. What would be your what changes would you make to the framework to kind of streamline the process, speed up delivery of housing? What would be your top three, say?
I work quite closely with a colleague in the industry called Clara O'Neill from Butler O'Neill Planning Consultants. And Clara has done a huge amount of work in this. There's not just three. There's a raft of...
Give me a number, ideas. Damien. We like statistics.
Well, we've discussed around 28 changes that we would like to see to planning. There are a few I can mention, just a few that I think are really important.
I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions.
A Section 247 process is where somebody can approach a local authority and ask them for their advice on a proposed planning application before they make the planning application. This is called a pre-planning process. Typically, in the past, local authorities would attempt to respond to those queries within 4 weeks. Now they're taking up to 16, 18 weeks, which makes them really redundant. This was an important process, or part of the process, where people could test the water of a potential plan, refine the design, etc. And when they were actually applying for planning permission, have a much better chance of success. But effectively, particularly in urban areas, this 247 process is now not really functioning. And that is because of the demands on the area planners and the senior planners and the executive planners. There's simply not enough resources in the planning authorities to deal with the 247 process, the pre-planning process, which is not statutorily restricted. A planning application must be dealt with within a statutory period. A pre-planning process, even though the aim is to deal with it within 4 weeks, it doesn't have a restriction, which means that because of the demands on personnel and time, that the time within which these are dealt with now have really extended far beyond making them useful. I would like to see a statutory period also for pre-planning processes. Now that would mean more resources being thrown at planning authorities, but I think that's a good thing in itself. The second issue, and it's been done recently by the government, is the waiving of planning contributions. These are often quite substantial. And the ability to claim a refund from Irish Water for contributions for water connections and this kind of thing. These have come to an end, but I would like to see that continued. It has proven itself. It is a huge initiative to developers to invest in development. And even though it was for a short period of time, I think extending those waivers would be a really positive step to encourage more housing development. It's also been our experience that there's a huge amount of invalidation. So you go through the process of preparing planning applications, putting them in, and then it's invalidated, often beyond the period within which you can still reapply because your advert in the newspaper has expired, etc., and all of that. In the past, it used to be the case that a planner would pick up a phone and say, there's a little piece missing from your planning application. Can you get this into me as soon as possible? And sometimes you're given a deadline of an hour or maybe an afternoon. And 9 times out of 10, you could achieve that. Now it's a case of it's simply written out that your planning application is invalid, back to square one again, and you're starting from scratch.
Which, Damien, that's a very simple thing, a simple process, a step to build into an SOP inside a local authority that, look, this is a little process, internal process we follow, resolved, and it gets another planning through. So that's a very simple change.
It is. Again, I think planning authorities would say, we're so stretched with our personnel that we don't have time to be picking up the phone, asking people to correct mistakes. And I'm not suggesting that you would ring up and say, we want something really huge changed in your planning application so we can validate it. But often minor issues like a north point not being on a plan or an incorrect fee or something like this. These could easily be dealt with, I think, by a change in that. Also, most local authorities now are dealing with planning applications by way of e-planning. So you're submitting them digitally, but not all local authorities are doing it. And some local authorities, like Cork City and Cork County, are just in their infancy at dealing with these. This is a much more efficient, a much more sustainable way of dealing with planning applications. And I think the more that that's rolled out, the better. Another kind of thing which is outside the control of planning authorities, but certainly is tied into it, is the difficulty in getting other agencies to deal with important planning issues. I'm thinking in particular of dealing with the ESB for electricity connections, Uisce Éireann for water connections, etc. I think the responses of these other public utility agencies should be set on a statutory basis, that they should have a set period of time within which to respond to queries.
Just since we're in such an emergency situation, which we are, there's a serious demand. We have a lot of young people emigrating, again, unfortunately, due to lack of housing, affordability, and obviously just affordability is a huge one, and job opportunities abroad. It's frightening just to see that, again, that people's kids moving away and not being able to afford. What's your opinion around kind of solutions around this, Damien, around the problem for young people? How could the government help more?
Well, I suppose there are two things here. One is the volume of supply. And when something is rare, it becomes more costly. The cost ratio between what people earned and the cost of a house has grown exponentially over the past 30, 40 years. Whereas a couple in 20, 30 years ago, looking for a mortgage, pay for a house, was quite easily achieved. Now, with the new kind of bank rules, just achieving the deposit for a mortgage is extremely challenging. But this is largely down to the cost of delivering the house in the first place. And until such time as we tackle the essential issues of labour shortages, the cost of land, the cost of development, as in planning applications, etc., until we address those, the costs of housing are going to remain at an all-time high, and putting a lot of people out of the market. The rental market also, I think we're discouraging people from getting involved in that because of the tax liabilities that people have to provide rental housing. And we've seen effectively a hemorrhage of landlords moving out of the system because of those challenges.
We have seen that, but if we just go back to the framework, as in when we speak about framework and about planning specifically, and look, we'll have a conversation later, I think, on rental tax breaks, regeneration of cities and so on. We see a lot of items in the media where there's people objecting to plannings, including politicians, people living in Canada who've no affiliation with the areas, and it's delaying, in some cases, developments of 300 and 400 houses. What change and improvements can be done via ministerial orders, or what process should be put in place to I suppose, from these people objecting without any cause or means, and there's no reason for them to object. Sometimes it can be they don't like the person, and maybe what we might talk about in a minute is maybe some statutory instruments which have been introduced. So if you could just take me through the process of, is it third-party appeal? Is that the correct word for it?
I suppose the first issue in relation to this is you must have the right to object. People can be affected adversely, indeed very adversely, by development. And the right to object, I think, is fundamental, and it should be supported and should be encouraged. However, the issue about how personally you're affected, or to what degree that effect is adversarial to you, is up for debate. I think the cost of making an objection is too low in the current climate. It's currently at €20.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
I think that should certainly be up at €100 for a local objection. The cost to appeal to An Bord Pleanála is at €220. Again, a very small amount. In the case of judicial review, where people are taking a judicial review, the first one of the first steps in that process is to establish locus standi, which means that you have a right to seek the judicial review. And you must demonstrate to the court how you will be affected, how you or your organisation, if it is an organisation, will be affected by the decision. I think while that might be a step too far at the initial planning stage, I think if somebody is going to appeal to An Bord Pleanála, I don't see it as an unwarranted intrusion on people's rights for them to demonstrate to Bord Pleanála how, if this permission is granted, on Comisiún Pleanála now, how if this permission is granted, that they personally are affected by the decision. I think that would reduce the amount of objections, and I think it would reduce the workload on local authorities and on Commission. Currently, you can be in Australia and object to development in Kinsale, which in the normal course of events you would imagine is a step too far. And I think there could be some kind of geographical restrictions on objections. But again, that is down to the Minister. But this is something that I think could quite easily be modified with a statutory instrument issued by the Minister.
Gotcha. And just in relation to other statutory instruments, like one I believe was the 40 square metres you can add on to a house without planning permission. Another one would be the S75. Damien, I know you've done a couple of those for us and our clients where there's a ministerial order and you can do up to 9 units without planning if it's vacant for 2 years. And again, I believe this was extended, Damien, was that?
Yeah, because of the housing situation in Ireland, the government were looking for ways to accelerate the delivery of housing options. One of those was the SI 30 of 2018, which was the original piece of legislation which allowed commercial premises to be converted to residential use without the need to apply for planning. That was very successful. It was extended in 2022 by the SI 75 of 2022, which extended it to the 31st of December last year. And that in itself has now been extended by SI 648 of 2025, which extends this facility to the end of 2028. And effectively what it means is that if you have a commercial premises, which has been vacant for 2 years, that can be converted to residential use without the need for planning permission, subject to certain restrictions. But it's proved very valuable. It means that because it's exempt, it's not part of the planning process. It means that there are no planning contributions involved in the process, and there are no Part 5 requirements where there are in standard planning, but there are no Part 5 requirements.
And for people who don't know what Part 5, this is a contribution towards social and affordable housing, effectively providing a unit at a certain discounted rate.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go into a little bit of history on that. A lot of the tenement areas in old cities and towns were addressed in the 1960s by a very major development programme by local authorities. In Cork here, Gronabraher, Farnry, etc. would all have been built under this. Ballyfihan, you had the same in Dublin and Ballymun, etc. And effectively, you were moving people out of tenant accommodation into local government tenancies in new built houses. Very, very effective. But because these were new communities and came with all the sorts of challenges that new communities would have, to embed those communities, the local authorities brought in a tenant purchase scheme, which allowed people to purchase their local authority homes. This had some very obvious advantages. It embedded people in their communities, developed private ownership, had kind of mixed tenures in developments. But on the other hand, it removed permanently housing stock from the local authority control and reduced their capacity to deal with new applications for housing. Actually, to the point where often they were buying back these houses that they had sold at a discount at full market rate, which made no economic sense. No. The state was subsidising housing very kind of substantially. So these were kind of challenges that we haven't really managed to address, in the sense that local authorities now rely almost exclusively on the private sector to deliver social housing. Now, what you do get in those circumstances is a bit of social integration, and where the council are not asking a developer to develop exclusively for social or affordable housing, the other way they do that is through what's called Part 5. And Part 5 is in essence a requirement by a developer to give currently 20% of the value of the uplift in the value of their property as a bonus to the local authority. If I can just explain that maybe.
And Damien, just on that part 5 section, we kind of discussed it briefly before as well, that it was 10%, it's gone to 20%, and you've a view of maybe scaling that on the number of units, because what we're seeing is it's great for the larger developments of 100 units plus, but we need to encourage the people who are willing to develop 3, 4 and 5 houses, because we need to, I suppose, encourage supply and get more houses into the system. So if you just give me a quick overview of how much it was before, how they've increased it, and just your view on maybe scaling that based on the size of the development.
Okay, well, let's just a brief overview of what Part 5 is. Yeah. So you buy a piece of land and it's bought for 200,000 and you get planning on it. Now, planning has increased the value of it, and now say the land is worth $1 million. So the difference between what you bought it for and what it's now valued at is 800,000. So you've taken your 200,000 initial cost away from its new value with planning on it. That's 800,000. You are now liable currently for 20% of that 800,000. Yeah. So that amount of money you have to gift to the local authority as a reduction in the market value of houses that you will give to the local authority. So say the property is worth 400,000, you're giving 400,000 less 40,000, you're selling it for 360,000 to the local authority. Previously, under the original Part 5, it was 10% of anything over 9 houses. The new legislation has now brought it to 20% on anything over 4 houses. So it's decreased the amount of houses, it's increased the percentage. So effectively it's quadrupled the take by the local authority in delivering social and affordable housing in private housing schemes. While, as you said, that could be quite acceptable for very large developments, to encourage developers, and there are lots in there, who are building 4, 5, 6, 10, 15, 20 houses, it's quite penal. So I would like to see a graduated requirement under Part 5 based on the amount of units that would be developed. You might have no requirement up to 6 units at all. You might have a 10% requirement between that and 10 or 15, and grade up to your 20% over your 4 or whatever. But I think that more subtle approach might be a very valuable encouragement for people to get involved, particularly the small. Not all housing in Ireland, as you know well, Michael, is delivered by the big developers. Huge volume of it is delivered by the smaller developers. And when you think of the other cost challenges for developers, we've seen firsthand over the past 10 years, dealing with developers, the real cost involved in development. You have the acquisition of the land, which is not cheap. You have the planning process itself. We had a recent development where we had 13 consultants, from environmental consultancy to engineering consultancy to arboriculturists, 13 consultants on one planning application. Then you have the planning contributions themselves. Then you have the cost of building, the cost of labour, cost of materials,
and
cost of health,
and obviously your finance costs, your 10% carry cost,
cost of health and safety. And when you look at the lending rate from the European Central Bank, what banks can borrow money for and what they're lending it for, the discrepancy is pretty remarkable. So yes, people see the old kind of Galway racist tent and the fat cats, and everybody imagines that developers are making absolute fortunes out of what they do. I have to say, in my experience, particularly with smaller developers, the risk that they take in putting developments together, and oftentimes with no guarantee of a grant of permission, and they've already expended money on land and on the planning application itself. It is a challenging environment to work in. Just on that, from the point of view of changes to planning, any piece of land that's zoned for residential development in the development plan,
Yes.
I think there should be a presumption that that planning will be granted. That's not always the case.
No.
There are places where have been zoned residential and planning applications have been refused for all sorts of reasons, some of them good, some of them maybe not so good, but definitely I think there should be a default position where there's an assumption that planning will absolutely be granted on zoned residential land.
And Damien, just in relation to, so we said we know the planning system is under pressure, enormous pressure. It's under-resourced. We need more resources in there. Maybe, reduce that pre-planning time, make it a statutory requirement. Just, I suppose, what I've noticed is there's an awful lot of planning permissions, especially for apartment developments around 25, 26 underground car parks. They weren't viable during COVID. They were parked. They're due to expire. Now they have to go back into the planning system again. Again, should the government not look at a ministerial order on this to look for extensions on these, so they're not going back into a planning under a system that is under enormous pressure already? Because obviously labour shortage, there's lots of reasons for delays. Labour shortages is a massive one, that the labour just isn't there. They weren't viable until they brought in the new scheme where they're paying contributions out towards new apartments, and they've made no available for affordable housing. So, there's a lot of plannings due to expire and have expired. Should there not be a reactivation process even on ones that have just expired that can become valid plannings and we can actually deliver housing now?
Traditionally, there was two main bases for extending planning permissions. One was that the development was not complete but substantially complete. That remains. The other one was that through circumstances beyond the developer's control, they couldn't complete the development within the agreed term of the planning permission. I think there was a general feeling that people who had gotten planning permission would sit on the planning permission for all sorts of reasons, maybe waiting for the price and value of development and houses to go up, etc., and that it was kind of used as a ruse that, I couldn't develop it, so give me another 5 years. And that second basis was removed. So now the only option available to local authorities to extend the planning permission is where they're satisfied that the development is substantially complete. That used to mean that it's up to wall plate level or roof level. And some of the court's decisions have suggested that it should almost be ready for occupation, that there should be very little left in the development process. So I think when you look at, as you've just described, Michael, when you look at COVID, what happened there, when you look now at the shortage of skilled labour, when you look at the challenges of financing development, that where a developer can demonstrate to the satisfaction of a local authority that the delays were genuine and caused by circumstances, again, genuinely beyond the control of the developer, that there should be a great deal more flexibility in allowing that. Now, by the way, the Planning and Development Amendment Act did allow for an extension of existing plannings for a further 3 years, which was a very welcomed move. But again, look, the idea that we should be more flexible at how we approach these issues rather than having rigid black and white rules, I think that would be a very beneficial thing to do.
Okay. Damien, thanks for coming in, and great discussion today on just your knowledge and ability to navigate around even the evolving of planning and current framework. So thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.